me opportunity to present my paper here today. I have to admit that this is my very first international conference and my very first international presentation. So if there's any mistake or any understanding about my language or anything, I do apologize. So today I'm going to present you about government procurement policy, the WTO, and the implementation of embedded liberalism doctrine. So the outline for today will begin with aim and objectives, and then I will move on to the embedded liberalism. What is embedded liberalism, and what is the relationship between the doctrine and the WTO, and government procurement concept, also the non-discrimination principle, transparency principle under the WTO implementation, also future directions, and the conclusion. That should take about 15 to 20 minutes for my presentation. And then all questions are welcome at the end, and I will give about 5 to 10 minutes to answer those questions. So the aim and objective of my research is to study and to analyze the relationship between the WTO, the embedded liberalism doctrine, and government procurement policy. Because on one hand, government procurement under the WTO itself, the WTO has an objective to reduce or eliminate tariff or trade barriers. And also the WTO implement non-discrimination and transparency principle. And this is to reach the objective of free trade and international investment and international trade. But on the other hand, of government procurement under the WTO also consider about social interests, environmental concerns, and employment. So taking these all objectives together can make me think like this. And so, what is embedded liberalism? So it is not banana like Mr. Shim think at the moment. So actually, it is an economic theory that first introduced during 1945 and 1947 by the Hungarian economist, and his name is Mr. Karl Polanyi. Mr. Karl Polanyi tried to capture the compromises between liberalization on one hand and the pursuit of domestic social and political objective on the other hand. Mr. Karl Polanyi described an economic theory that the economy is not autonomous as it must be in economic theory, but it's subordinated to political objective, religions, and social relations. So later on, the embedded liberalism was become well known by Professor John Gerard Racki during 1980, and Professor John Gerard Racki explained the principle of the embedded liberalism that on one hand, government try to bargain between safeguard domestic policy, protect domestic social welfare, full employment, favor to national and citizens, also social security and national stability. But on the other hand, government have to bargain between globalization and free trade. So this is the obligation that any government have to implement within this objective. So many scholars have studied about embedded liberalism doctrine. But for example, one scholar see that the embedded liberalism doctrines refer to the compromise which government made after 1945 between safeguarding their domestic economy objective, especially a commitment to maintaining full employment and opening up the domestic economy to allow for the restoration of international trade and investment. This is the whole idea of the embedded liberalism doctrine. So the embedded liberalism doctrine It was implemented between 1945 to 1970, and it was referred to the golden age because an exceptional economic boom during that period. And that was matched to the implementation of the GATT. Until later on, during 1970, many governments, especially developed countries, have moved from embedded liberalism to a new type of economic theory that's called neoliberalism, which is since Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came to power, and that many developed countries try to put this new economic idea into the GATT implementation and put into the Uruguay round in 1986. And then the outcome is the establishment of the WTO in 1995. And many scholars have argued that neoliberalism is good because it's effective and make global economy efficiency. But on the other hand, the authors see that it's not. It delivers something that's totally different. For example, recently, the columnist in the Guardian newspaper, he has his opinion that if you think that we are done with neoliberalism, think again. So why? Because he thinks it's a fraudulent economic. So it's brought any developed country to its knee. So go down to the hill. That's what he said. And he said it's 30 years on the experiment, and the result is totally failure. So this is what he thinks. And he also referred to the last year at the annual report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and he said this is something that's opposite outcome. Because of neoliberalism policy, this type of policy, it's cutting tax for the rich, also privatizing state assets, also reducing social security, and also create unemployment rate. So this is what columnists think about neoliberalism since its implemented in 1980. But what is the relationship between government procurement and the embedded liberalism? How we can put this together? So because of government, any government has the power of purchasing power, that they have to make sure that they do everything through government procurement, and government procurement have three common criterion that has been widely used. The first is the lowest price criterion. The second is the most economic advantage tender, and the last one is value for money. But most important thing is any government has public obligation, because government cannot implement anything without considering about their citizen, about social security, about their people. Otherwise, there's no chance that they're going to come back next time when they have an election. And to make sure government try to put everything on government procurement in the right direction. For example, to make sure that social consideration, environmental concern, or economic have put to the right thing when they do government procurement. And this is the whole general idea of government procurement. So let's take a look more closer about each criterion within government procurement. The first one is the lowest price. It is straightforward and it's simple because it's based on the price criterion. But the next one is the most economic advantage tender. It's more complex and effective. But many government entities, they are free to define the criteria themselves that they want to procure, what they want to do with this project. But however, this criterion has created an issue in interpretation because it's based on discretionary when they award the contract. So how the EC Commission interpret to this criterion? The EC Commission said each individual award criterion has to provide an economic advantage which directly benefit the contracting authority. So according to this statement, what we can see, if we put the objective of embedded liberalism, we can see that this is justified only economic basis, but maybe not justify social consideration. The problem of social or the problem of environmental is still there. It hasn't been solved or resolved. So this is what happened to this criterion. So we move to another criterion, is value for money. This is another criterion for government procurement. So is this justified all criterion, social, political, and economic consideration? So if we see, according to the EC Handbook on Environmental Public Procurement in 2011, it says contracting authorities have an obligation to get the best value for taxpayer money for everything they purchase or they procure. So what we can see here, value for money could be the best way. But first we have to answer this question, whose money? Of course, it's taxpayer money. So we have to make sure that taxpayer money put into the optimum use, and most importantly, to justify public obligation. So any politics or any government cannot deny that public obligation is the important thing and the first thing that they have to do, they have to deal with. So they have to put economic, social, and environmental concerns in the right way. And this is the trend at the moment because the WTO itself is transforming into a socio global organization, and also the EC interpret that. And EC try to put social concern and environmental concern into public procurement as well at the moment. And so the non-discrimination principle is another principle under the WTO that any government has to consider, because this is the cornerstone and it's very difficult to practice. So if we take a look more closer, non-discrimination principle complies with two elements. The first one is most favored nation, or MFN obligation, which is prohibits the discrimination between products, services, and suppliers between countries. And another element is national treatment, or called NT obligation. So it prohibits a country from discriminating products, services, and suppliers against other countries. This is what we have to deal with. Another principle is transparency principle. So what is exactly about transparency principle? So do we have to do this if we implement government procurement under the WTO or under the EC1? So transparency means openness, clear objective, clear procedure, traceable, and to be audited. This is the main general idea about transparency. And future direction, because of at the moment EC try to integrate environmental considerations, social consideration into government procurement. So this is the trend that happened at the moment. The European Court of Justice also held that the award criteria did not necessarily have to be of purely economic nature. So this allows government to implement some degree of social concern, environmental concerns, and political concern. And the WTO itself have now moved towards promoting secondary policy, especially social and environmental concerns. So what about government procurement in the future? So do we still stick only buy things that cheapest price? So the answer is no, because at the moment every organization have to put themselves to international cooperation, and the most important thing is social consideration and environmental concern is more rise the issue at the moment in the world. So here's come to the conclusion. Embedded liberalism refers to an economic theory that try to capture the compromises between, on one hand, the liberalization, and the other hand is the pursuit of social and economic for domestic policy. And the embedded liberalism denotes the implementation of the WTO itself. It also relates to government procurement, which if government have to do or to purchase something, government procurement can reflect the objective of embedded liberalism doctrine. Also, non-discrimination and transparency principle. We have to more concerned about this issue, because once government implement their policy within embedded liberalism doctrine, it is definitely that government have implement some level of non-discrimination. So how the non-discrimination principle within the WTO can justify, or what level, or is there any exception or exemption that we can have or government can opt for. And the future direction, of course, it's more towards to the social consideration and environmental concern. So I think the future of government procurement anywhere in the world, it is undeniable that government cannot practice only economic criteria, but also social concern and environmental concerns. This is the future direction that we have to look through. And more importantly, we have to look back to what happened during 1945 to 1970, which is refers to the economic boom or the golden age of the embedded liberalism, and what lesson can be learned during that period. So this is my presentation for today, and thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Surasit. I invite some questions now from the audience.
Well, can I just ask, is embedded liberalism same as order liberalism?
Pardon?
Is that the same as order liberalism?
Order
liberalism, ORDO.
I'm not sure about order liberalism, because at the moment it's I only focus on the liberalism, neoliberalism and embedded liberalism, but I'm not sure about the order liberalism. Is it like some kind of social liberalism, or?
I think is it kind of typified by German legal structure, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe I have to study more about that one. Thank you.
Thank you for your paper. I've just been thinking and pondering about the context of which the tensions arise. considering that the GPA is plurilateral and the WTO is multilateral,
Yes.
and within the context of the plurilateral agreement, there is that negotiation between the parties that come into the context of that agreement for there to be an award criteria which is not based just merely on lowest price, but also on the most economically advantageous tender. Is it not within the confines of that criterion to then embed the embedded liberalism concepts in order that within the confines of that restriction, that is then addressed?
So actually, what it means,
And then you don't have the tension with the overarching WTO agreement principles of MFN or non-discrimination.
So the whole basic idea of embedded liberalism is an economic theory at the very first on the top.
Yes.
That what is the direction that we need to go? Are we going to use neoliberalism, which is detached economic consideration apart from social consideration and political objective, or we are going to use the embedded liberalism, which is embedded all together?
Yeah.
So this is the first thing that government or any organization have to consider. But it is true that government procurement agreement is a plurilateral agreement.
Yeah.
But once we understand about the general idea of an economic theory, which we're going to practice now or in the future, so we know that embedded liberalism happened during 1947 and then 1970, and it can tell us something that why this economic theory has something that make economic in the world boom in that period. But it is more kind of, yeah, it's a more kind of a political bargain that government have to make. So that's why we see that many member country in the government procurement agreement under the WTO, it's still only a quarter of the whole WTO member. So, and most member country is developed country. But why developing country or less developing country still sit back and have a look? So, well, I'm not sure that I'm going to be a part of government procurement agreement. And this is what's going on for about 20 years, 30 years. So.
But if you change that construct, do you think it's going to stay? If you change, because what you're arguing for is the change of the construct, would it then open the door for developing countries, or are there not other issues that are of more significant concern to developing countries?
So because of the non-discrimination principle within the WTO itself, it's quite very hard and it's a cornerstone, and it's very difficult for any government to practice because government has to consider both economic and social, and they have to look back and to look after people or citizens in the country first. So it is public obligation that they have to make sure that before they do, they have to make sure that people in the country is ready and support to do that. So I think general idea about my research here can be a part or a section that introduce to whether or not the non-discrimination principle within the WTO should take consideration or should be some exemption or what kind of level that we can go through within the WTO implementations.